It was late October, and the air in Silver Pines had a bite to it, one of those crisp autumn evenings where the sky fades into a deep, bruised purple, and the forest surrounding the small town feels like it's holding its breath. The Turner family lived at the edge of the town, their backyard bordering the dense woods that seemed to stretch endlessly. Lucas Turner sat in the back seat of his mom's car, looking out the window as the trees passed by, their black silhouettes bending and twisting like old giants caught in frozen motion. Lucas was 12, with the kind of quiet demeanor that often got mistaken for shyness. His dark hair always fell over his eyes, which he hated but never seemed to fix, and he had a habit of biting his lip when he was deep in thought. He loved drawing, monsters, to be specific, big, grotesque creatures that he imagined hiding in places no one ever looked, under beds, behind trees, in the dark corners of his mind. His mom said he had an overactive imagination, but that never stopped him from filling page after page with nightmarish figures. Tonight, though, monsters weren't on his mind. Instead, it was excitement. Jake Richards, his best friend since kindergarten, was hosting a sleepover at his grandfather's old house. Lucas had never been there before, but Jake always described it with a gleam in his eye, talking about the house like it was this secret, forgotten treasure in the middle of the woods. Old, isolated, creaking, and full of hidden rooms. Jake's grandfather had died years ago, leaving the house to sit empty, gathering dust and letting the wild overtake it. Jake had moved in with his mom after, but the house still belonged to them. It was far enough away from town that most people forgot about it, surrounded by thick, towering trees that blocked out the world. No one ever bothered going out that far. There wasn't any reason to. Except tonight. Lucas's mom pulled up the gravel driveway, her tires crunching under the weight of the car, and he felt a slight knot tighten in his stomach. The house was bigger than he imagined, sprawling in the shadows, its windows like blank eyes staring out into the blackness. The porch light flickered weakly, like it wasn't used to being turned on. "Looks spooky," his mom said with a smile, her eyes glancing at Lucas in the rearview mirror. "You sure you want to stay here tonight?" Lucas didn't answer at first. The house seemed to loom over them, every inch of it sagging with age. But the knot in his stomach loosened as he saw Jake and the others running up the porch steps, laughing and shoving each other. He smiled and shrugged. "Yeah, I'll be fine." She gave him a reassuring look. "Call if you need anything." He waved her off and jumped out of the car, grabbing his overnight bag from the back seat. As he made his way toward the house, he could hear Jake's loud voice carrying on about the snacks he'd stolen from the kitchen and how they were going to stay up all night playing video games. Inside, the house smelled old, like wood and dust, and something else Lucas couldn't quite place. It was colder than he expected, too, the kind of cold that settled into your bones without you realizing. He followed Jake and the others through the dim hallway, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floorboards. The walls were lined with pictures of Jake's grandfather, an old man with stern eyes, always wearing the same serious expression. Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes in those photos followed him as they walked deeper into the house. Jake's mom wasn't home. She'd left the boys alone, which only made the night more thrilling. Jake led them into the living room where a pile of sleeping bags and pillows was already set up. Megan, the girl from their class who could always talk her way out of trouble, was sprawled out on the couch, flipping through TV channels, her blonde hair falling over her face. Emily, quieter, sat cross-legged on the floor, her attention already on the pile of board games. The house creaked around them, settling into itself as night fell. Outside, the wind picked up, making the trees sway in a rhythm that almost felt alive. "All right, boys and girls," Jake said with a grin, dumping a bag of chips onto the coffee table. "Who's ready for some ghost stories?" Lucas rolled his eyes, but he couldn't help the small smile that crept onto his face. Jake loved this stuff, scaring people, making them jump at shadows. He lived for the thrill of it. "You've got a real one for us this time?" Megan asked, raising an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by Jake's theatrics. "Oh, this one's good," Jake said, his voice lowering as he grabbed a flashlight and flicked it on under his chin, casting eerie shadows across his face. "You've heard of the Smiling Man, right?" Lucas's stomach dropped a little. The Smiling Man. Jake had mentioned him before, usually when they were walking home from school, or when they were hanging out at the park at dusk. It was one of those urban legends that Silver Pines kids passed around like a shared secret, each retelling making it darker, creepier, more twisted. But something about the way Jake said it now, in this old house with its groaning walls and long, empty hallways, felt different. "No," Megan challenged. "That sounds stupid." Jake's grin widened. "You don't believe me?" Lucas shifted on the floor, glancing at Emily, who was already looking uneasy. The wind outside picked up again, rattling the windows. "They say he lives in the woods," Jake continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Always watching, always smiling. At night, when it's darkest, you might see him standing just at the edge of the trees, grinning like he's waiting for something. And if you make eye contact, you're done. He follows you. He waits until you fall asleep, and then he gets you." The room fell silent. Megan rolled her eyes but didn't say anything. Lucas felt that knot in his stomach return, a small, creeping unease. He forced a laugh. "That's so dumb, Jake." Jake shrugged, still smiling. "Believe what you want." They moved on to games, movies, and more snacks. But Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every time the wind howled, he glanced toward the windows, half expecting to see something standing there, just beyond the tree line. Hours passed, and one by one, the others began to fall asleep. The TV played softly in the background, casting blue light across the room. Jake was already snoring. Megan had passed out on the couch. Emily curled up in her sleeping bag, her breathing steady. But Lucas couldn't sleep. He lay there, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house settling. The wind outside had died down, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. Then, faintly at first, he heard it, a soft scraping noise, like something brushing against the floor. His heart began to race. He sat up slowly, looking around. The room was still. His friends were all asleep. But that sound, it was coming from beneath the bed. He leaned over, hesitating for just a moment, before lifting the edge of the sleeping bag and peeking underneath. The space was dark, too dark to see anything clearly. His breath caught in his throat. His fingers trembled as he reached for the flashlight. Click! The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but dust and shadows. He let out a slow, shaky breath. Maybe it was just his imagination. He settled back into his sleeping bag, closing his eyes. But then, another noise. This time, closer. And it wasn't just scraping. It was laughter. Lucas couldn't shake the sound. That faint, eerie laughter had etched itself into his mind, looping endlessly as he lay there, frozen under his covers. It was so soft, like it came from far away. But it was unmistakable. Each time he thought it had stopped, it would creep back, like a whispering echo. He squeezed his eyes shut, hoping, praying, that it was just his imagination. After all, it had been a long day, and Jake's ridiculous stories always had a way of getting under his skin. But then he heard it again, clearer this time. The laugh was low, stretched out, as if whatever was making the sound was forcing it through twisted, smiling lips. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest, each thump reverberating in his ears, drowning out everything else. He opened his eyes slowly, glancing around the room, careful not to move too much, like shifting even an inch might draw attention to him. The glow from the television flickered across the room, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. His friends were still there, scattered across the living room floor, their breathing steady, peaceful. Jake's mom wasn't coming back until the morning. That meant no one, no adult, was around to check on them. No one to turn on the lights and reassure Lucas that everything was fine. They were alone. His grip tightened on the flashlight he'd kept tucked beside him. Slowly, he reached for it again, fingers brushing the cold metal, just in case. But deep down, he knew that no amount of light would change the feeling creeping up his spine, the one that told him something was wrong, that whatever was making that noise wasn't his imagination at all. He lay there, paralyzed by indecision. Should he wake the others? Should he turn on the lights and risk looking stupid? Jake would laugh at him, call him a scaredy cat, like always. But as the laughter came again, clearer, more insistent, Lucas felt the edges of his fear curl into panic. He couldn't do this alone. Lucas sat up slowly, careful not to make a sound as he edged closer to Jake. His friend was sprawled out on his back, snoring lightly, his chest rising and falling with the kind of ease that Lucas wished he could feel right now. He reached out, shaking Jake's shoulder gently. "Jake," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Wake up." Jake groaned, rolling over, his hand swatting at Lucas as if he were nothing more than an annoying bug. "Come on, man," Lucas whispered more urgently. "I heard something." Jake opened one eye, glaring at Lucas from under his arm. "Go back to sleep, dude," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "You're being paranoid." "I'm not," Lucas insisted, his words barely above a whisper. There's something in the house." That got Jake's attention. He pushed himself up on his elbows, rubbing his eyes and glaring at Lucas in the dim light. "What the hell are you talking about?" "I heard laughing," Lucas said, his voice faltering. "It's coming from under the floor or something." Jake stared at him, his brow furrowed. For a second, Lucas thought he'd laugh, make fun of him like usual. But Jake didn't. Instead, he turned his head slightly, listening to the silence that had settled over the house. There was a brief moment where neither of them moved, their breaths suspended in the air. Then they heard it, a faint scraping noise, followed by that same distorted, unsettling laugh. Jake's eyes widened, and for the first time that night, Lucas saw fear flash across his friend's face. It wasn't long, just a flicker, but it was enough to make Lucas's skin crawl. Jake sat up fully, glancing toward the hallway that led deeper into the house. That's just the wind or something," Jake said, his voice lacking its usual bravado, but even as he spoke, he couldn't look Lucas in the eye. Lucas shook his head. "Wind doesn't laugh like that." For a moment, neither of them moved. The room felt colder, like the temperature had dropped by several degrees in just a matter of seconds. Lucas's breath caught in his throat, and when he exhaled, it came out in a thin, visible mist. Jake looked around, his mouth opening to say something, but no words came out. The laugh returned, louder this time, more distinct, as if whatever it was had come closer. Lucas swallowed hard, gripping the flashlight like it was the only thing tethering him to reality. His eyes darted toward the darkened hallway. They had to check. Whatever was making that noise, whatever was playing tricks on their minds, was real. And it was somewhere in the house. Jake stood up, motioning for Lucas to follow him. "Grab your flashlight," he muttered, his voice hushed, as though speaking too loudly might wake something up. Lucas didn't need to be told twice. He turned on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the floor and walls with shaky light. The others were still asleep, blissfully unaware of the creeping terror in the air. Jake moved quietly toward the hallway, Lucas following close behind, their footsteps muffled by the thick rug beneath them. The house felt different now, more alive, like it was listening to them, watching them. Every creak of the floorboards under their feet made Lucas flinch, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. The shadows along the walls seemed to shift as they passed, stretching and twisting into shapes that disappeared the moment his light touched them. As they reached the hallway, the sound of the laughter stopped. Silence settled over them, heavy and oppressive. Lucas stopped, looking over at Jake, whose expression had hardened into a mix of determination and fear. "Maybe it's nothing," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. They walked slowly, cautiously, the dim light from Lucas's flashlight sweeping across the old wooden floor. The walls seemed to close in around them the further they went, and every instinct in Lucas's body screamed at him to turn back, to run, to wake everyone up and leave the house. But they kept moving, deeper into the darkness. The hallway led to a narrow staircase, its wooden steps sagging under their weight. Jake moved ahead, gripping the banister as he descended, while Lucas followed closely behind. The air down here felt different, heavier, staler, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. At the bottom of the stairs was a door, old, thick, and slightly ajar. Jake hesitated, his hand hovering just above the doorknob, his eyes narrowing. "This door wasn't open before," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Lucas's stomach twisted. He knew it wasn't. He'd been down here earlier with Jake, when they'd grabbed extra blankets from the storage room. The door had been locked. They hadn't even bothered to try and open it. Jake glanced back at Lucas, then, with a deep breath, pushed the door open. The smell hit them first, musty and damp, like old earth and something rotting. The room beyond was pitch black, even with their flashlights shining into it. the darkness swallowing the beams of light like they didn't exist. Jake stepped forward cautiously, his breath coming in shallow bursts. "There's nothing here, see?" he said, waving his flashlight around the room, though his voice shook. "Probably just a soft rustling came from the far corner, and both boys froze, their flashlights swinging toward the sound. There, just at the edge of the light, something moved. Lucas's breath hitched. It was barely visible, a shadow within the shadows, but it was there, small at first, almost too small to be anything. But then it grew, shifting as it came closer, its outline vague and undefined, like it was part of the darkness itself. And then, the smile. Wide, gleaming, unnatural. Lucas's heart nearly stopped. The smile didn't belong to anything human. He knew that instinctively. It was too big, too bright, too wrong. It hung in the air, disconnected from the shadows around it, and the longer he looked, the more it seemed to stretch. "Run," Lucas whispered, his voice trembling. Jake didn't need to be told twice. He turned and bolted up the stairs, Lucas right behind him, their flashlights bouncing wildly in the darkness as they sprinted back down the hallway. They didn't stop until they reached the living room, slamming the door behind them. Jake leaned against the door, panting, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. "What the hell was that?" he gasped, his voice shaking. Lucas couldn't speak. He could still see that smile in his mind, burned into his vision like a flash of light. It was real. Whatever it was real, and it was still down there. They stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity, listening for any sound from the hallway, any sign that the thing had followed them. But the house remained eerily quiet. Too quiet. We need to wake the others," Lucas finally managed, his voice weak. Jake nodded, swallowing hard. He crossed the room to where Megan and Emily were still sleeping, shaking them awake with more force than necessary. "Guys, get up. Now." Megan groaned, rubbing her eyes. "What? What's going on?" "There's something in the house," Jake said, his voice still trembling. "We have to leave." Emily sat up, looking around groggily. "What are you talking about?" "I'm serious," Jake snapped, his panic flaring. "There's something here. We saw it." Megan frowned, glancing between the two boys. "You're freaking out over nothing." "Do we look like we're freaking out over nothing?" Lucas shot back, his voice sharper than he intended. He was on edge, his nerves frayed from the fear that still gripped him. "We're not making this up. There's something wrong with this house." Megan opened her mouth to argue, but before she could speak, the laughter returned. All of them froze. The sound was unmistakable now, clearer, closer. The same low, distorted laughter that had haunted Lucas earlier. It echoed through the house, bouncing off the walls, coming from every direction at once. The girls went pale, their expressions shifting from confusion to fear in an instant. What is that?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Lucas didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat had gone dry, and the words wouldn't come. All he could do was stare at the hallway, waiting for whatever was out there to show itself. The house groaned, the floorboards creaking as the laughter grew louder, more persistent. It was coming for them. "Out the back," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get out." No one argued. They scrambled toward the back door, their footsteps hurried, frantic. Lucas's heart was racing, his entire body shaking with fear. They had to leave. Now. But as they reached the door, the laughter stopped, and everything went silent. The back door was only a few feet away, but it felt like miles. Every second stretched into an eternity, as Lucas, Jake, Megan, and Emily scrambled toward the exit, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The laughter had stopped, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. It pressed down on them, thick and suffocating, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse loud in his ears as he reached for the door handle. His fingers trembled as he twisted it, but the door didn't budge. His stomach lurched. "It's locked," he whispered, his voice tight with panic. Jake shoved past him, yanking at the door with both hands. "Come on," he growled through gritted teeth, pulling harder. The door rattled in its frame, but it wouldn't give. It was as if something on the other side was holding it shut, keeping them trapped inside. "Jake, stop!" Megan's voice cut through the tension, sharp and desperate. "We need to stay calm." "Calm," Jake snapped, turning to face her, his eyes wide with fear. "How the hell are we supposed to stay calm? There's something in this house." Megan took a step back, her face pale, but she didn't argue. She didn't need to. They all knew it. Something was here. Something that didn't want them to leave. Emily clung to the back of the group, her wide eyes darting from shadow to shadow, as if expecting the smile to materialize at any moment. "What do we do?" she whispered, barely able to keep the tremor out of her voice. Lucas's mind raced, searching for an answer, but he couldn't think straight. His thoughts were a chaotic jumble of fear and confusion, and every second they spent standing there felt like a countdown to something worse. Much worse. "There's another door," Jake said, his voice steadier now, though his hands still shook. "In the kitchen. We'll try that one." Without waiting for a response, Jake led the way, moving quickly through the dimly lit hallway, his flashlight cutting jagged beams through the darkness. Lucas followed close behind, his grip tight on his own flashlight, as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. The others trailed after them, their footsteps barely audible on the creaking floorboards. The kitchen felt colder than the rest of the house, as if something had drained all the warmth from the room. The shadows here were deeper, more oppressive, and Lucas's flashlight barely seemed to penetrate them. The windows were frosted over from the cold night air, and the pale light from the moon cast long, eerie patterns across the walls. Jake reached the kitchen door and grabbed the handle. He twisted it, and for a second, Lucas felt a surge of hope, but then the door refused to open. "Locked," Jake muttered under his breath, pulling at the handle again, his frustration boiling over. "Why won't any of these—" "Look," Megan interrupted, her voice trembling as she pointed toward the window. They all turned to see what she was pointing at. At first, it was hard to make out in the murky light, but as Lucas squinted through the fogged glass, he saw it. Movement. Outside, just beyond the edge of the trees, something was out there, just standing in the darkness, watching them. A figure. Tall. Thin. Smiling. Lucas felt his blood run cold. The figure didn't move, didn't approach the house. It just stood there, bathed in the pale light of the moon, its wide, unnatural grin clearly visible even from inside. The grin was too big, too wide for any human face, stretching across the figure's face like a grotesque mask. I see it," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Her body shook violently as she gripped the back of a chair for support. "It's just standing there," Jake cursed under his breath, backing away from the window, his face pale. "We need to get out of here, now." Lucas's heart raced as the figure outside took a single step forward, its smile never wavering. The movement was slow, deliberate, as if it were savoring the moment, watching, waiting. "Jake," Lucas said, his voice tight with fear. "We can't stay here, we have to—" The lights flickered suddenly, plunging the room into darkness. Emily screamed, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Lucas's heart nearly stopped as the sound of the laughter returned, louder this time, echoing through the house, bouncing off the walls. It was closer. "Flashlights, now!" Jake yelled, fumbling with his own flashlight. The beam sputtered to life, illuminating the room in shaky bursts of light. Lucas's hands trembled as he turned on his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness just as the laughter reached its peak, and then it stopped. For a moment, they stood there, frozen, the only sound the ragged gasps of their own breath. The air was thick with tension, and every shadow seemed to pulse with the promise of something lurking just beyond their reach. But the figure outside was gone. "Where did it go?" Megan whispered, her eyes darting toward the window. "It was right there, I saw it." Jake shook his head, backing away from the door, his face pale. "It's still here, it's just hiding." Lucas swallowed hard, his throat dry. "We need to barricade the doors, we can't let it get in." Without waiting for a response, he grabbed the nearest chair and shoved it against the kitchen door. Jake followed suit, pulling the kitchen table over and bracing it against the window. Megan and Emily did the same, their hands shaking as they worked to block every possible entrance. But even as they barricaded the room, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that it didn't matter, that whatever was out there Whatever was playing with them didn't need to come through the door. It was already inside. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, sharp knock at the door. Everyone froze. 3 knocks. Slow. Deliberate. Jake's eyes widened. It's here. No, Megan whispered, shaking her head, her eyes filling with tears. No, it can't be. The knocking came again. 3 knocks. A slow, eerie rhythm that echoed through the room. Lucas's pulse raced, his heart slamming against his ribcage. His flashlight trembled in his hand, the beam flickering wildly as he pointed it toward the door. The barricade they had built seemed flimsy now, laughable in the face of whatever was out there. Another knock. Jake took a step back, his hands trembling as he raised his flashlight. What do we do? No one answered. The knocking stopped. Silence fell over the room once more, thick and suffocating. Lucas held his breath, his entire body tense as he waited for the next sound, the next move. And then, slowly, the door began to creak open. The barricade didn't even slow it down. The chairs and tables they had piled against it slid to the side as if an invisible hand were pushing them away, clearing a path. Lucas's heart raced as the door swung open, revealing nothing but the empty hallway beyond. The laughter returned, echoing through the house like a sick, twisted melody. We need to run, Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the laughter. Now. Without waiting for a response, he turned and bolted toward the living room, the others following close behind. The house seemed to close in around them as they ran, the walls warping and twisting in the darkness, the laughter growing louder with every step. They reached the living room and stopped, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The front door loomed ahead, their last chance at escape. Jake reached for the handle, but before he could open it, the lights flickered back on, and standing in the center of the room, bathed in the harsh, unnatural light, was the figure. Its smile was impossibly wide, stretching from ear to ear, its eyes gleaming with a cold-on-John, malevolent light. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching them, its grin never faltering. Megan let out a choked sob, backing away, her hands trembling. What is that? Lucas couldn't speak. His throat had closed up, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. It was impossible. It couldn't be real. And yet, here it was, standing right in front of them, grinning like it knew something they didn't. The figure took a step forward. Jake grabbed Lucas's arm, pulling him toward the door. Come on, we have to go! But Lucas couldn't move. His feet felt like they were rooted to the floor, his body frozen in place as the figure took another step forward, its smile growing impossibly wider. And then, in a voice that was not a voice, a sound that was not a sound, the figure spoke. You're mine. Lucas's vision blurred, the world around him spinning as the words echoed in his mind. His heart raced, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps as the figure reached out toward him, its fingers long and twisted, its smile still locked in place. And then, everything went black.